Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and welcome to The Conversation Continues with author, teacher, and consciousness researcher Penny Kelly. The first part of this conversation on the topics of Kundalini consciousness, energy, and the coming changes was broadcast on Om Times Radio's flagship show, What is Going On February the 9th. If you haven't heard it yet, you'll find it in the show archives on Om Times Radio. Before we begin, here's a short recap on author, teacher, and consciousness researcher Penny. In 1979, Penny experienced a full spontaneous awakening of Kundalini that completely changed her life. The experiences that followed, which are shared in 7 riveting books, include visitations from a group of small men in brown robes who shared explicit information about what is now coming to pass, encounters with a group of elves living on her farm, and explorations of other dimensions, which revealed the multi-dimensional structure of the psyche. She also had a collaboration with biophysicist and scientist Dr. William Levengood, whose study of plants and soils from crop formations in 1999 revealed astounding secrets about energy and the nature of consciousness. Today, Penny is going to share information that we didn't have time to cover on last week's show. About Kundalini awakening, its role in the evolution of humanity, the stages of spiritual development, and what she learned from her intensive year-long study of the history of humanity that encompasses 40,000 years, lost civilizations, the goddess, religion, sex, power, consciousness, energy, and human transformation. Penny, let's start with a brief explanation of what catapulted you on that year-long investigation.
It was a total collapse of all the pillars of my life. My mother died, Dr. Levengood died, my sister died. You know, there were a number of other people in the family who died, but I was very close to those first 3. And then there was also the realization that the people that I really admired and thought were fabulous in terms of their research and their work and their teachings were, especially Carlos Castaneda, turned out to be a fraud. And I was just destroyed over that because that was a major pillar of my life as well. And then the other pillar was the discovery that the entire Catholic Church was basically a fraud as well. I mean, I have to say it that bluntly. And my disorientation as a result of all of that happening within 11 months was just enormous. And I felt, my mother is gone. My sister, who I absolutely adored, was gone. Dr. Levengood was kind of a companion in the laboratory. We were doing research into consciousness and energy, lots of things. And that was over, and so I was left kind of drifting. So that's what started it.
So the journey then began with a book, I think it was History, Fiction or Science, by a guy called Dr. Anatoly Fomenko, who was a Russian mathematician. Let's establish some of the credentials here. Tell us a little bit about Fomenko and then about some of the sources that you went to back up, this whole experience of the Catholic Church was just an invention.
I think when I was taking care of my mom that last year, I heard a radio program about somebody who declared that the whole story of Jesus was a fake, was made up by the Catholic Church. And I was incensed. I thought, how dare he? So I remembered, the name of the book was History, Fiction or Science. And so I bought the book, but I was too busy to actually read it because I was so busy taking care of my mother. And I thought it was some New Age flunky who was just trying to get attention. So that turned out to be a long way from the truth. He's a formidable Russian scientist and mathematician. He ended up writing a series of 8 books. There's History, Science, or Fiction or Science, Volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. It's all about chronology and the study of history and the methodologies that are used to determine, what happened when. I did not know that mathematicians were responsible for what's called the chronology of history, the timeline of history. And it turned out that Fomenko had been a young kid, graduated from college, and got what sounded like an early job and was assigned to do some kind of chronology work. And chronology, all of the old ancient documents are dated using the position of the sun, the moon, the stars, eclipses, things like that. And so he had been given this document. He was told that he was to verify the date on it. And so he was working to figure out, where the sun, the moon, and the stars were at that point in time, and it didn't line up. And so he was like, wait, this, something's wrong here. And so he went to a bunch of his peers. They all told him, be quiet, you don't know what you're doing here. And he couldn't leave it alone. And they laughed at him, and for years he would go back, he would study, and then he would go talk to some more scientists and some more mathematicians and more historians and more archaeologists, and he just got deeper and deeper and deeper until 40 years later he had constructed this humongous timeline. I forget how many feet long he said it was, like 6 or 8 feet tall and 20 feet long, that had the entire history of the world, event by event, as it happened. And what he did along the way was to make friends and to convince a lot of people who were finding anomalous material in their studies, and they began working together until there were 150 major scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, etc., in Russia working together. And what they said basically was that the entire Western story of history was a fiction, and that the evidence was that approximately I think it was 1,800 to 2,300 years, extra years, had been inserted into the timeline, and that the, quote, ancient past was actually much closer in time than was generally accepted. And so there's all kinds of evidence. And when you read it, I actually took the time to study his methods and the way that they calculated, which was long and tedious, but it was very impressive. It was extraordinary. And I came out of that thinking, oh my, it looks like he's telling the truth. And so that left me in a position of saying to myself, why would the church lie? What were they trying to pull over, or, pull the wool over us? And so that question was kind of driving me when I began to run into a lot of work by other historians and archaeologists that did not agree at all with the regular, what I'll call the accepted timeline of history. So it was quite the journey.
Well, yeah, it's fascinating, and you really, you're an impeccable researcher, and you really back up everything that you're saying. So many historians took their work from Eusebius's Chronicle, or the fragments thereof, and as often happens in history, people repeat what they've read in another source, They don't necessarily go all the way back and check themselves.
That's true. That's true, and pretty soon you have this massive edifice being built, and maybe one brick in the edifice is actually accurate, and the rest is conjecture.
Yeah, and you also raised the point of how many of the works of Plato and other so-called, historians, whatever, actually all turned up during the Renaissance.
Yes.
It was lost for so long, but all happened to turn up then. So do you think that there was something going on during the Renaissance, that some kind of conspiracy going on, or was it just accidental that they all turned up then?
Well, this was a stage in the mystery for me where I was saying, why would so many people be forging documents? Why would there be so many things that there was absolutely no evidence of until, the 1500s, the 1400s, the 1200s. There was nothing in the before those times. And so that question was hanging over me, and gradually I came to realize just it was a key word. You know how sometimes you'll read something and it just strikes you as what? And the phrase that I read, and I forget who said it, I think it was Merlin Stone, who said in the book, When God Was a Woman, that the history of the bloody history, or the bloodthirsty history of the Christians. And I was like, what do you mean bloodthirsty? What are you talking about? And so there was this, continuous, I'd figure out one thing, and I'd end up with 10 more issues surrounding that, and so I'd go digging deeper. And it turned out that in that period of the Renaissance, I'm going to say from maybe the 12th century to the 18th century, the bloodletting and the incredible violence of society in Europe was just extraordinary. What was happening was that the goddess cultures, which the church had dubbed the pagans, and had made them out to be really, really bad people, all screwed up, didn't have the right story, blah, blah, blah. The Christians were trying to get power over everything. They wanted total control. They were not, they were very similar to today's Muslim terrorist groups that basically want to establish themselves and their own little caliphate. The Christians were doing the same thing, exactly the same thing. And they spent probably, I'm going to say, close to 1,000 years, maybe less because of the timeline being screwed up. But they spent, centuries just getting rid of women and the goddess cultures in order to institute the patriarchy, in order to get power. They killed everything that argued with them. They killed everything that got in their way. And they continued to do that, and it was bloody. It was extremely bloody. And there was a lot of intrigue. There were a lot of betrayals. The history and the traditions and the wisdom of the goddess traditions all went underground. It just disappeared, except for, I think the traditions, you can see bits and pieces of them in the Masonic, stories in the Masonic temple, and the Knights of the Knights of Malta, and there's all kinds of sort of underground organizations that tried to preserve the information and the wisdom, but over time they lost the thread of what were they preserving. What was the point of all of that? And I think that whole atmosphere during the Renaissance was one in which people realized there was so much persecution going on. They said, okay, we think we can put this document out there, and we can date it like 500, 1,000 years ago, and we can put a name on it of somebody, and we can say, oh, look what we found. We didn't write this. This isn't, this is coming from way back when. And so there was this deluge of forged documents that were put out that were full of common sense and wisdom and old science and old technologies, and the church had a really hard time getting around that because they had too many fronts going. They couldn't handle all of the conflict and all of the fronts that they were fighting on, and so some of that stuff slipped in under the wire, and then pretty soon we had this kind of a, oh my gosh, there's this whole, it was actually a renaissance of thinking, or a renaissance of the old information and the thinking about that information and what it applied, or what it implied. And what it implied was that there was some information there that had been lost. I think the tarot cards, or some people call it the tarot, that deck was basically a symbol of ancient religions and ancient wisdom. And if you know the truth, you can see that deck and go, oh, wow. This is about the journey to transformation and the journey to full evolution, awakening, opening of the human energy system. And when that happens, you have a different kind of consciousness, you have different powers available to you, etc. And so that period was a watershed period. And the church just, too many other things were happening. The printing press, the church had outlawed books, and no one was allowed to read. They outlawed all of the old knowledge around astronomy, and they kind of pushed that into the category of astrology. No information about the stars and the impact of energy was allowed. No comments about energy were allowed. And so, there was also the invention of new forms of money, and so this huge deluge of documents, the new money, the new kinds of technology, the printing press made books available to a lot of people. The church just couldn't keep all of that down. And in the midst of all of that, because life in Europe was so bloody and so miserable, and every other year, you had to follow this religion, and the next year it was somebody else's religion, or you would end up dead. And they purged a lot of priests and priestesses, and, the whole, witch burning things was the last of the effort to get rid of the goddess cultures. But then you had the discovery of America, the rediscovery of America. And that, that just gave people a place to escape to. And I consider it a sign of how bad things were, that people were willing to get in these little wooden boats with sails and sail across that gigantic ocean in order to get away from the chaos and the persecutions and the inability to feel, think, and do as you felt was necessary for you, and go to this new place called America, or New India, whatever it was called back then, and to try to set up a new life. And so in many, many ways, America became the hope of the world because it was leading us out of that oppression that the church and the early Christians practiced, just as a matter of self-righteous arrogance. So here we are today, no place to run.
Some people listening to this will just be, absolutely outraged by what they're hearing. Others will be shocked. Others will say, yes, I know that. I just want to, in case people want to go and do some research for themselves, you write about the book, The Christ Conspiracy, the greatest story ever sold, in which the author, her chapters include the search for physical Jesus, the holy forgery mill, evidence of fraud in the Gospels, astrology in the Bible, the Son of God, spelled S-U-N, the 12 disciples as the 12 signs of the zodiac, etc., etc. And in that book, I was surprised to read how many other ancient saviors had supposedly been born to a virgin, slain for the salvation of mankind and rose from the dead, including Horus, Osiris, Krishna of India, Mithras of Persia, Zoroaster, so many, 41 in fact, all having elements of the same story. And obviously, what's happening here, if that's to be believed, is that someone's taken all of those and conveniently, put them into one. I mean, when you think about how that period of time, 16th, 17th centuries, how the Catholic Church rampaged across the world, trying to change people, trying to, get rid of any pagan beliefs. It's just appalling. I remember having an interview. I did a series of interviews called Inside the Mind of God a while back, and I did interviews with different people, a Hawaiian kahuna, a scientist, a shaman, a Native American, etc., etc. And the one thing that impressed me the most in all of it was listening to the Native American talking about his people and God, and how when, the Catholic Church or whoever, came to America and started calling them pagans, he said they didn't understand us because when they asked us about God, we said, God is all around us. And they said, no, oh my God, you people, you need to be educated. Yeah. And, it happened. That kind of thing happened.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, and tragically, most of the great wisdom was lost. It's like we've lost our food wisdom, we've lost our healing wisdom, we've lost our evolutionary wisdom, we've lost our wisdom about Mother Nature. We've lost a lot. We need to start putting the pieces back together again. And, there will be people who will be upset. But I think the thing that's really important to understand is that if you know the truth, which is one of the benefits of having had Kundalini, and you see, I've experienced the full 9 yards of what that evolution is about and where it's supposed to take us. And you see that there are bits and pieces of truth in every single system, but the system itself is actually in the way of being able to put it all together and make sense of it and then make use of it. So, that it's not all. It's like you take a little bit of the truth and you twist it up and you decorate it and you add a bunch of stuff that's totally distracting, and it sounds good and it passes for a system, a religious system. The real truth of any religion is that, we are designed to evolve. And, the gods were not some, imaginary mythical creatures that never existed. They were beings, human beings, who unfolded the entire energy system in the same way that an acorn unfolds and becomes a giant oak tree, or a bean seed becomes a bean plant and produces all these beans, or tomatoes, or, the seed. We are seeds, and we don't realize how much more unfolding there is to do yet.
Wow. And it's quite telling that even, as you point out, the prestigious Catholic Encyclopedia admitted, and I'm quoting, the idea of a complete and clear-cut canon of the New Testament existing from the beginning has no foundation in history.
I know. Isn't that amazing?
Isn't it? Yeah.
When I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, they're saying right there that the whole thing is fraudulent, that there's nothing there. And so it was really pretty shocking. And I think there was another piece in that, something like, I forget how it went, 150 pieces of information. Of that 150 pieces of information in that system, 149 or 150,000 pieces of information. And of that, 149,500 were not true. That's like, what are we reading that for? Why are we following that? Why are we believing that? So it's like, oh, wow. Lots and lots of stuff to sort out. And I think that's part of the hero's journey, is that sorting process. You know, you wake up, you begin to understand that something's not working, and then you have to sort fact from fiction, truth from illusion. Bias has to be washed out, etc., washed out of the system. So, we have this tremendous history that really is so inspiring. And I think if people even get a hint of how inspiring that is, they could really take all of the religions, put them together, and say, let's add the truth now, and we've got something that we can work with and move ahead with and develop the consciousness into a much more expansive state than what we've had in the past. So,
okay, so let's, I think we're beginning to get a picture here. Let's move on and look at why they wanted to wipe out the goddess. I mean, there is some incredible information in your book about how we lived when, it was a matriarchal goddess-led society, how peaceful everything was for thousands of years. And it was only when it became patriarchal that, it became so warlike. And I'm not knocking men here, So much of it was revealed to you in Leanne Eister's book, The Chalice and the Blade. Will you share a little bit about that with us and how that affected you?
Oh, wow. Yeah. It was it's a very powerful book. One of the things that I began to realize when reading Chalice and the Blade was that there was a lot of evidence, a huge amount of evidence that indicated that the goddess cultures, went back as much, at least 25,000 years, and there are now artifacts that are, have been dated to 800,000 years ago. So you've seen these little goddess figurines. They all have these great big boobs and this great big butt, and they have no face. They're always faceless. And they often have a little triangle that is inscribed right down by the crotch of the woman. And some of the artifacts are blatantly, framing the vagina, and the whole goddess culture was about celebrating birth and the amazing event that birth is. From their point of view, birth was something that brought another being who was going to make this journey into full evolutionary power into our world. So, but that isn't the way that the early archaeologists and historians saw these little figurines. They thought of those things as some kind of, ugly sex object, and thought, wow, those people back then, they had some weird ideas about beauty and about sex. And, they thought they were talismans for some kind of hunting. And, and so it took a long time. That was the accepted interpretation of those artifacts until women began to get into education and into archaeology and history. And they started looking at these artifacts, and they started noticing that, across thousands of artifacts, there was always the same message. This woman with these great big boobs and this, looked like she was pregnant and a great big butt. And what they began to understand was that this was kind of like the statuary kind of stuff that the goddess cultures used to communicate their amazement over the richness of Mother Earth to give birth to all forms of life. and to nurse all forms of life, plant, animal, and human. And it wasn't a single individual. It was just the earth herself. And then there was a male, a fellow, I think his name was Marshak, and he was studying some of these, engravings on some ivory, I think it was, some tusks. And they had always been characterized by male archaeologists as harpoons and spears and weapons. And this guy, Marshak, is looking at these things and saying, this just doesn't quite look like a real harpoon. The barbs are at the wrong end, and they're pointing in the wrong direction. So, it's starting to look like more of what I would call like a bush or a tree or a plant or some kind of living thing. And then, they began to, communicate. I think the Internet has been a wonderful way of bringing people's information together. And more communication going on, more and more sharing, and now this entire picture of the way the world used to be has emerged. And it is clear that there was a long period of time when women were in power, and that their basic approach to life was one of, sharing of all things that give life, nurturing plants, animals, people, etc. And I think that it was a very high creative period of time. Even if you're going back, 7,000 years, some of the systems that are showing up in archaeology, people had paved streets, they had wheeled vehicles, they had amazing kinds of gardens, they had writing, art, dance, music. They lived in houses where they had ovens, altars, private beds, and just a lot of stuff that I was surprised to read about. And their whole celebration of life was the constant renewal and regeneration of life. And that, I think, was pretty much when the goddess or the matriarchy was in a place in which it was really still, it hadn't gotten corrupted. It did eventually get corrupted. But, that everything in that model was that women were in power, women were the priests, they were the judges, they were the businessmen, or businesswomen, rather. They were the ones who made all the decisions. Men took care of the house, they raised the children, they did the cooking, they did the laundry, they did the cleaning, they did a lot of the everydayness, the weaving, etc. And so it was a time when everything was reversed. Men were definitely not in power, and when that matriarchy began to degenerate and it began to corrupt, I think there was a definite effort to make sure that men did not ever get into power. And I think that sparked a backlash, eventually, that I call the men's movement, back in maybe the 1500 BC with Abraham. And he, for me, stands for this, this man who stood up and said, no more, no more. And there were some other things that were happening, too, that women did. They used men in their celebrations, and there were ritual slayings of men. And that was what men, and of children, and that was what the men began to revolt against. If you look at the story of Abraham, the story goes he was going to, he was told by God, quote unquote God, which was probably a goddess, to go out and sacrifice his son. Well, he didn't want to sacrifice Isaac, and probably he didn't want to because he'd been raising this kid since the beginning. And he loved that child. And it was the same kind of love and protectiveness that we mothers feel today. We're deeply, deeply connected to our children. And we love them. We'd give our life for them. And that, that story of Abraham is kind of like a turning point. And, he went out, he built the fire, he put Isaac on the pile of sticks, was going to do whatever he was going to do. I don't know how he was planning to do it. And something in him said, stop. This is not going to do any good. It isn't going to fix, children and men were sacrificed to just kind of celebrate the fact of there's a problem here, we're making up for it, or as a statement of belief in reincarnation. Men were sacrificed as a statement of belief in reincarnation. Children were sacrificed to fix problems. And it was, that's awful. I read some of the stuff and, and I was like, oh, yuck. That we have really, in some ways, come some distance. In other ways, we haven't come anywhere. We haven't moved an inch at all. There's still that kind of thing going on, and it is still awful. But anyways, back in the days of Abraham, he began to, I think, gather men, and they began to move, and they just viciously killed everything that threatened them or that frightened them, and it became this whole patriarchal movement, and they were adamant. They were out to destroy every shrine, every altar, every setting where the goddess was worshipped, and you can read in the Bible. I've read the Bible 3 times, and the first time it was like, what? And the second time it was like, this is pretty gory. The third time it was like, this is really somebody's history. This is not the Word of God. It's somebody else's history. And, their stories, et cetera, and their struggle to define what is God to us and who is God to us. And so, when you get into reading some of those stories, you begin to understand the great struggle that men had, and the cross, the guy who died on the cross, they often say Jesus was the last man to die on the cross. He died for the rest of us. Well, he did. He died, and no more men were sacrificed. That was their symbol of, we're not having this anymore. We've tolerated this kind of, celebration. It's not much of a celebration from their point of view, for a long time. And no more. We're not having this anymore. And so I think that cross became sort of the symbol of the men's movement, and the fact that no more men were going to be sacrificed to the goddess, for the goddess, by the goddess, or anything, having to do with that kind of.
We're looking here at kind of gender wars. I just want to quote something from your book.
Okay.
Just to underscore what you've said. Psychologist David McClelland, the author of Power, the Inner Experience, described 2 overarching motives in civilization, an affiliation motive and an imperial power motive. And in a study of literary and historical materials, we found that times in which the affiliation motive, or what we would call more feminine, peaceful and compassionate values, gained strength, were followed by times of peace. Conversely, periods when writings again showed a shift to what he called the imperial power motivation, what we call the masculine dominator motivation, almost invariably culminated in wars. Now, obviously, the affiliation motive, the time when that was in evidence, sounds like it was wonderful, especially to us women. And it sounds like, when the power motive was in play, it sounds awful, but that too, now you've explained to us that it's almost as if the feminine motive, it was unbalanced. It's unbalanced.
It was
to be fully in one or the other is unbalanced, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It has to be a cooperative, and co-creative kind of thing. It has to be. Otherwise, it's just not going to work well for everybody. So that's so important. You know, we can't. I know some women who are saying, "Down with men." You know, we have to get our power back, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not the way to go about it.
That's not it. No, absolutely. You know, some 20-odd years ago, when I was living in England, I wrote a book called Sex, Lies and Love, How to Understand the Opposite Sex. It came out just before John Gray's Men Are From Mars, and his really did, sweep the board. So it kind of put mine into the shade a bit, but my book was very successful in England and got translated in a few languages. But the point I was trying to make then, this same point about the gender wars, the battle of the sexes, and, women saying, why can't he be more like a woman, and men saying, why can't they be more like a car or something, Yeah. And my ending words in that book, and I'm just reminded of this, were, we are not going to find what we want. We're not going to create the world we want until I becomes we and me becomes us. We've got to celebrate our differences and work together.
I know.
Do you think that we're on a path towards that? I mean, we hear so much about the feminine rising right now, that the seesaw can easily tip the other way again if we're not careful.
It can, and we don't want that. The thing that has, the quote that you read about every time we move toward this, bringing women in and we move toward a society that's more characterized by cooperation and affiliation, we end up with the patriarchy creating wars. That's how they keep us divided. And I have been very, very concerned that there's such a huge effort on the part of some people, I guess I'll say the cabal at this point, to bring us back into war, to get us distracted from all of the good stuff that is unfolding, that people are figuring out. And I think they've run that scenario one time too many, and people are beginning to get that. But we'll see. We're not out of the woods yet. So lots of personal growth is still needed by lots of people. So, and I think this year may actually begin to turn the tide in a major way with lots of people.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I do a podcast called the Cosmic Buzz podcast with an astrologer from England, and she likes to think of herself as a somewhat skeptical Gemini, and while she has long wanted the transition, part of her has been skeptical about it ever arriving, and yet she's just been looking at the astrology for the next 4 years and says, you know what, we're in it. This is it. The astrology is unprecedented, the things that are happening in the sky, and we are going to be in a completely different place at the end of the next 4 years. So what do we need to do? Obviously, it's about raising our consciousness. If we can do that, if we can raise our consciousness, then we can begin to get some understanding of who we truly are and how we want to live. So tell us about that. How do we raise our consciousness?
Well, I like to use the term expand the consciousness because I like to get away from the hierarchical language. And so to expand, you have to begin to be present. You have to begin to address the landscape of the self in a very deep way. You have to begin to be able to name what you're feeling and to look at that and to change that, because everything arises from feeling. Your feeling is your most basic state. It is your true state. And that doesn't mean that there's one feeling that, you should have and another you should not have. That means that you need to learn to manage the feelings you are having. All of your thought comes from or arises out of your feeling. And thought is actually an attempt to manipulate or change the way you feel. That in that feeling, however, is all of your power. And if you abstract yourself from that power, you've got no power. You have to be in that feeling and having that feeling, whatever it is. And if you want to make it be different, then you do have to go in and examine, what did I decide as a result of this kind of feeling? Because we're told, right from the time we're born, look at this, see that, this is how you should think, this is how you should behave, this is how you should feel, this is what you should do, this is what we will ignore, and you can't ignore anything. You have to be present to it all. And, like the whole process of awakening is beginning to be or come to face with yourself and your truth. And it has to be something that bears, how would I say this? It has to be something that you come to, like I could say, this is my truth, and I insist that this is the truth. If it's not really true and it's just what you want to be, good luck with that. You're going to end up stumbling. You're going to create more lessons for yourself. You're going to end up with places where this stuff falls apart or there's great difficulty, etc. When you come to the truth, the truth of how you feel, you have to examine, why do you feel that way, and is it something that you've convinced yourself you should feel? And then you come to what's really worth hanging on to. What feeling is worth hanging on to? And what comes down to, slowly, you detach from a lot of your old biases and your old attitudes, and the deepest ones are the hardest ones to let go of. But, you come to this place where you let go of who you were. You literally die. And in the ancient religions, there was always, not literally, but there was always an encounter with the tiger within. And that tiger within would tear you apart. And you would believe that it was really happening, that you were really dead. And that was a part of the true process of awakening, and that, there's a whole bunch of stages of unfolding and development that we go through, and so it's really hard to, capsulize it. We have the first stage, the first 4 stages. We seldom get through those without serious damage, so you have to go back and begin to correct those, and then there are the later stages of development. And then there are, further stages beyond that we're not ready to really address. They don't make a whole lot of sense to us here now, but they are astounding, absolutely astounding kinds of consciousness. So it's a process. It's well worth the effort, and what you get out of it is a place of peace. You get this presence, this power. And you see deeply. You see the big picture at all times. So, and that just continues to unfold and open you further and further and further. So,
before we bring this to a close, I want to quote something from the end of your book on Energy and Consciousness, Volume 3. You say at the end, the entire planet, including all of her green, furred, finned, and feathered friends, are waiting patiently for us to approach our eternity. We cannot do this if we are caught in fears, war, and destructive behavior. We cannot begin to approach our destiny in the low levels of consciousness we currently maintain. So our destiny is what? Immortality?
Yes. Yes, we are at a level of consciousness where we have been unable to move past death. Among the ancient ones, they were able to do that. That's why they were called gods. They moved past death because they had the ability to continuously regenerate the self. we have lost so many of our basic wisdoms that it's very difficult to do that. But I think, we're beginning to move in the right direction with health, with governance, with education, with healing, lots of things. We're beginning to reconnect with Mother Earth slowly, and we can't disconnect from the body, because that's the vehicle that we have developed to carry us to immortality. Once we get to the place that we can regenerate using consciousness, then we begin to approach our eternity. The entire system, we are in a reality system. Every reality system is an incubator for various forms of life. That reality system, our reality system, is based in the earth, and it's amazingly diverse. Oh my, it's beautiful compared to some others. But the entire system goes into an eternal condition together. And so if the beings that the earth has produced, if they don't make it, the whole planet collapses. So that sounds so extravagant to say. You really have to, begin to understand that we are the incredible gods, goddesses, or we're meant to be, of Earth, and that we are supposed to evolve to the point that we can take the entire system past death. And that, that's something that we need to work on. And they are waiting for us. And they all know that we're the man, so to speak, to use a patriarchal term. We're the ones who have to, stop destroying and start regenerating. It comes down to being able to regenerate. If we don't do that, we will collapse, and the earth will start over with a new kind of people that may evolve in a slightly different direction, but the hope on the part of the earth is the same. The earth is a living being, and that is that she will raise a civilization of people who will develop to the point that they can take the whole system eternal. And that's, I think, it's too complex to really go into too much more deeply than that, but it's really it's time. We're at that turning point. We're at that fork in the road where we have to have a whole new path that we're working toward, that we're following, a whole new set of understandings, a whole new paradigm for our beingness. And we haven't had a new one for roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years. We're still worshiping gods and stuff and going nowhere. And if we're going to survive, we have to do something different here very quickly.
Penny, we started this conversation talking about your experience in 1979 with your Kundalini awakening, and then what came afterwards, which included visitations from the group of small men in brown robes who shared explicit information about what is now coming to pass. I mean, reading your book, The Robes, we do get we can understand, because we're seeing many of these things. They predicted that the wall would come down, not the Mexican wall, that's not gone up yet, but the other one in Germany. Yeah. They predicted so much that we know is happening today. We can track that. And they gave you information and visions of the future, of different potential futures. Did they give you any information about the final outcome?
The robes did not really say, this is the outcome you have to have. They did show me an outcome that they said we were headed toward if we could make the change. If we could, and it wasn't a change, it was a lot of changes. Changes in consciousness, changes in lifestyle, changes in how we fed ourselves, how we educated ourselves. There were a lot of things. But I think the thing that is really, really important is that they wanted us to understand that we have to take responsibility for the world that we want, that the future is ours to create. And that, excuse me, that was something at that time that I was just hardly able to get my mind around, because it was something that was so different. I was, much more fatalistic back in those days, and not in power, didn't have any idea what power was, and they wanted us to take up our power and to use it, and to use it in a way that would make something beautiful, something that we could be proud of. So, in terms of outcomes, they really said it's up to you. But then when they showed me, they took me into the future. It was the year 2413, and I got a chance to see what we had evolved to. So in all, I had been in around 2050, 2085, 80, 90, 2090 in there, and then we skipped to 2413, and so I saw little bits of the evolutionary process that had occurred, and it was really it really hung together. And I thought, oh, I didn't realize that until much later, but it did really. What I saw in 2050 were the threads of what became a lifestyle, very, very different technology, different kind of energy, everything being done in a way with a whole different set of expectations for life. And the expectation that they wanted us to, to kind of take in, to integrate into ourselves, was this integration of life as, how would I say it? The goal of life was to evolve the self. And you had to take personal responsibility for that self and what you wanted. At the same time, you were working with, thousands, tens, millions of other people and what they were trying to make. And they said, you can come to a common vision. You will come to a common vision. And life could be very, very different. And I thought, okay, yeah. At the time, it was always yeah. But now that I look at that, I'm really thrilled about what's possible for us.
I was really intrigued and also filled with hope. At some of the visions they painted, people living together in community, not necessarily as people that might be envisioning it today, but, like a whole apartment block with, members of the same family or like-minded people living and working, sharing what they did for a living, whether it was producing, something, commodities or beautiful artifacts or whatever, that they had the common work purpose, the common philosophies, and so they become like a family, in that unit. It was just such a beautiful picture.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really surprised me about the things they showed me. People who cared about the planet, people who cared about one another, people who cared about their family, and people who had what I'm going to call like interlocking skill sets, would come together to make something happen. And, no matter what that thing was that they were making happen, it was always something that was, they did it with an eye to how can we produce this and live in the midst of this production. So there was no polluting. There was no destruction. They weren't willing to do anything that made the planet sicker or, made certain areas just totally, ugly, and people not willing to live in those areas. You lived and you ate and you worked with the people and in the place where you did everything. That was your neighborhood. They called it a family business neighborhood. And that was really very astounding to me. It was beautiful. Now that I think about it, it's like, oh, wow. I think we are hearing and seeing people talking about what happened to community, what happened.
Yes.
And I think, we're in this stage of this cell phone and iPad and computer awareness that we have to go through in order to break down what those technologies do is break the bonds, the old bonds that we used to have between one another. And we have to go through this stage because at the other end of that stage of this development is this amazing technology that doesn't really need us much at all. And the result will be this kind of a resurgence or renaissance of human connection, because at the time that we get to the point that everybody's broken apart, nobody's, looking, listening, talking to one another, etc., because they're all talking by machine or, by tool, tech, phone, etc., the result is that there's going to be this renewal of awareness that you have to have recognition from other people in order to exist, and you have to have affirmation, and you have to have input from them in a very real and human way. And that, that's something that I think we're going to come to celebrate in a whole new way, and that will give us the freedom to create those communities. But right now, everybody's still pretty locked into what I call 18th and early 19th century lifestyles, and those will continue to break down until they break us beyond the point that we say, hey, no, and we recreate those, but with in a whole new style.
Well, Penny, your book, The Evolving Human, which I've just finished, which completes all of your books that I've read now, really does lay out, what we need to do and how we can go about accomplishing that. So do you have anything else that you want to add before we end?
I don't think so. I think, I think that people can only absorb so much information at a time, and it has to kind of go in there and rattle around and, and work its way in, and then you can add some more. But, I think as in closing, I would just say, as you look out at the world, see it with eyes that recognize that there's an evolution happening here, and they're usually messy, and they're always wonderful in the long run. So, have hope. Use your eyes in a way that show you that the glass is half full, not half empty or not empty. So,
good advice, Penny. Penny, I want to thank you for joining me in this extended conversation. I really felt it was important to finish what we had been talking about. I mean, we actually haven't even begun to, scrape the surface of the information that you've shared in all of your books. But this is a good place to begin and end, and maybe we will have more conversations in the future. I really do hope so.
Okay. Yeah, I would love that. I think people do need to get a coherent picture, not bits and pieces and dibs and dabs here and there.
Yeah, I agree. So, a little bit of background. Penny Kelly is the owner and director of Lily Hill Farm in Southwest Michigan, where she teaches courses in developing intuition and the gift of consciousness, getting well again naturally, and organic gardening. Her books, which include The Evolving Human, The Elves of Lily Hill Farm, Robes, A Book of Coming Changes, Getting Well Again Naturally, From the Soil to the Stomach, and 3 volumes of Consciousness and Energy are available on Amazon and from her website at Penny Kelly.